people have been putting in quite a few questions to the chat already. So what I'm going to do is ask each of the 3 speakers we had so far in turn one of the questions, and then I'm going to ask, there's another question that came in that applies to everybody, and then if our discussants would like to pitch in as well, that would be great. Cristina, you were asked a kind of factual question about the sibling data and where it could be accessed and what it was, which you might like to combine with a more substantive question, which is about whether you looked at the kind of degree obtained, because that might matter more than the type of university and might minimize the type of university effect.
Thank you for these questions. And sorry, I actually forgot to say which data the sibling data come from. So this data come from the Scottish Longitudinal Study, which is a large-scale linked study which is created from different administrative data sources, especially the census 2001, 2011. So we used practically census data to work on the sibling design and using practically the sibling design from the census data. And they are fantastic data. The only thing is that you need to have access to this data. You really need to go to a safe setting, which is the data are held in the National Record of Scotland. But as I said, they are fantastic resources. So if you're interested in this data, get in touch with the SLS team. Regarding whether we looked at degree types, absolutely. These we know from previous research that degree types are very important. But interestingly, possibly because we were looking at I would say education and employment trajectories, they looked much less relevant to explain inequalities in the trajectories. We know they have an impact on occupation in general, but when you look at pathways, the trajectories like we did, they weren't, I mean, the degree, the field of study was not so important or so strong in its effect on determining which pathway graduates were taking. But of course, they explain in some cases a bit of these social inequalities, but not as much as the type of university. The type of university, though, I have to say, I'm referring to was mostly for entry into the high professional and managerial job. It's that trajectory which was very powerfully predicted by what type of institution you attended.
That's really interesting, Cristina. Thank you. I have a question for Ingrid that's a little bit tricky, but quite interesting from a policy perspective. Ingrid, if you had to choose between policies which reduce risk factors and policies which support the development of protective factors, which ones would you choose?
Well, no doubt I would choose the programs targeting risk factors, because I think if you can reduce the risk, you can reduce the suffering, as one of the comments also said. And I think there are already lots of evidence about programs that can work, for example, reducing poverty. There has been, for example, this famous Great Smoky Mountain study of youth, where they actually introduced a casino, and they shared the profits amongst all members of this Indian reservoir where this was taking place. And within 5 years, they already saw great impacts in improvement on the young people's health, on their self-esteem. And these impacts, they had long-term effect. When they visited it 10 years and 15 years later, these effects were persisting into the next generation. So I think without doubt it is programs that are aiming to reduce the risk factors. And as we have heard from Neil, current policies actually try to increase the pain and suffering instead of reducing it. And I think there should be discussions about issues or topics such as universal basic income, or at least the living wage and the youth guarantee at a minimum, to secure the well-being of the young people today.
Okay, thank you. That's very clear, and it's very clear to have a quick and sharp response for policymakers in the audience. So Adriana, there was a question about kind of some of the methodology that you used. One person said you're looking at the bottom income group, those who are ever in the bottom quintile, but this may not have happened by the time of some of your outcomes. So they're saying when you look at vocabulary scores at 3, that person might not actually be in the bottom income group until they're 10. So could you comment on the kind of complexity of trying to account for that, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Emer and Rebecca, for asking this question. So indeed, yeah, it's a very good, valid point that you know, we need to take into account, you know, the chronology of circumstances when modeling certain outcomes. But I must say that we did actually also, you know, look at age-specific measures of disadvantage. You know, so we had the disadvantage at age 3 to look at, you know, outcomes at age 3 and so on for each age. And I must say that the percentages are quite similar. So we just decided to present those for the sake of clarity and keeping the same measure as the one we used to define our sample, so being at least once in the bottom quintile. But for the second part of the analysis, where we are looking at the chance of being above the median, so having successful outcomes at the age of 10, we go on and we actually control for the timing of disadvantage. So besides you know, working on the sample who are one time in the bottom quintile, then we go on and specifically model, you know, the persistence of disadvantage, how many times and when, you know, in different time points, from 10 months to 3 years, and then from 4 years to 5 years, and so on. So yes, we are trying our best to keep the timing of circumstances in line with our outcomes. But this is a good point. Thank you very much.
That's a very useful clarification. Now, I have a comment that kind of I want to throw open to all of the speakers, and it goes to the heart of the topic of the seminar. So they're saying, focusing on individual ownership of risk, of resilience rather, as a way to overcome societal structures of inequality runs the risk of divorcing responsibility from the state, and so forgives it for its negligence and symbolic violence against the working class and the poor. Would any of the presenters or the discussants like to comment on that? Like, what do you see as the appropriate kind of balance, if you like, between kind of holding the state accountable and also allowing for kind of agency or resilience at the individual level? Ingrid, could I pick on you if nobody's jumping in?
Yes, I think it is important, for example, not only to emphasize individual agency and efficacy, but to emphasize collective agency and resilience. And I think we are all embedded in these social structures. And if we just shift the responsibility to the individual, it might lead to victim blaming instead of encouraging. So I think it is important to think as a whole think of individual lives embedded within the wider social system, and not forget about the important role and structure of our societal institutions, which are supposed to support our living in society.
And Neil, would you have any comment on that from a point of view of kind of trying to influence policy?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, wholeheartedly agree with what's just been said. I mean, I think over the past decades in particular, we have seen a narrative develop, although it's maybe lessened in the period of the COVID pandemic, but we have seen a narrative develop around, you know, benefit scroungers, for example. And there's been a sort of the individualization of poverty, and as you say, victim blaming, when we know that poverty is purely a result of decisions that are made by governments. It's a result of decisions that are made about our labour market. It's the result of decisions that are made about our social security system, and it's the result of decisions that are made about how power is distributed, whether it's economic power, democratic power, whatever, and also public services. So yeah, the emphasis always has to be on the structural. And just picking up on the specific comment as well, I do sometimes get a little bit nervous as well when we talk about resilience, because that does sometimes kind of individualize the experience of poverty when we know that poverty is a structural phenomenon. So yeah, I would agree with a lot of the comments.
Thanks, Neil. And Sakshi or CJ, would you like to comment on that issue, or even another question that was asking about, well, what is the role of educators to enable better life outcomes for students?
Well, in terms of what educators can do to more help young people, is like, I know educators are obviously they doing the work they join that work to help young people. That's why they do what they do, and I know that they have young people's best interests at heart, but they can't go about saying, how do we help young people? What's the best thing we can do? What can we do? It's more, you need to ask the young people. You need to talk to the young people, involve the young people in discussions. Because if you don't do that, then you're just doing what you think is best for the young people and not actually doing what young people want. And I think also involving like more, like, you know, making it more person specific. Like every young person is different, just like every adult is different. Each young person requires their own individual help and support. So, you know, making it specific to each person, and also including, you know, minority groups as well, like, you know, young carers and you know, people that are care experience, and you know, people who are of different ethnicities or who are LGBT. Just like, you know, just involving everyone in that conversation and making it more specific for each individual group and each individual person is the best way to help support young people.
Emer, I'm sorry, I think you're muted.
Rookie mistake, 9 months into the pandemic, and I muted myself. I just wanted to follow up either CJ or Sakshi, and whether you think that young people are often expected just to get on with things rather than, you know, being allowed to expect supports to be put in place. Are they expected to be more resilient than is fair? Or have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, like, I think that young people are, you know, quite like, when they're grown up, they're seen as stuff like being depressed or having anxiety as grown up, going through the motions. You know, you've got your hormones. They're not seen as actual being problems. So it's like, you'll grow out of it. Don't worry, like, it'll pass with time, and they're not actually given the proper support they need. So it's like, I think that it is quite like pushed to the side, because like, it'll be fine in a couple of years, like, you'll deal with it. That's what happened when I was younger. So it's like, you know, they aren't given the proper support they need, and I think that they are told to just kind of get on with it more. And I think that that is one of the bigger problems, that young people feel that they can't speak up because they'll get told that.
That's really helpful. Now, we're coming close to the end of our time. I just have kind of one question that was asked across all of the speakers, so whoever would want to address it. They're asking about the position of people with disabilities and where they fit in this discussion of inequalities. Have any of the researchers who are presenting looked at this issue, or what would the potential research agenda look like? Cristina, would you like to say something?
Unfortunately, the data we have don't have enough cases to be analyzed, you know, in terms of disability. So we are unable to look at specific issues about disabled students or disabled young people. But I know that other researchers, for example, in my school, are doing research on issues of disability, and what they often found is that families, more advanced families with children with disability are usually better equipped to gain the support they need both in school and outside the school, while disadvantaged parents ended up not having even the information they need to be able to help their children to achieve better outcomes, so to get the support they need both at school level and outside school. So I think there is an issue there that unfortunately, we don't have equally distributed information across different social groups.
Thanks, Cristina. Now, unfortunately, we've run out of time on our session, but I think it was a great session with lots of really interesting questions, brilliant presentations. So I'd like to thank the speakers, Cristina, Ingrid and Adriana. I'd like to thank the discussants, Neil, Sakshi and CJ. I'd like to thank Isabella for organising the webinar and Frank for so ably moderating and grouping the questions. And I'd like to remind the audience that this is part of a series of webinars. The next one will take place on the 28th of January, and it's called How Does Politics Shape Inequalities? And it's drawing on a University of Derby project which tries to look at the long-term effects of crime and contact with the criminal justice system resulting from changes in the economy and social policies around the new right, Thatcherism and austerity policies, as we've already discussed. So information is on the Understanding Inequalities website. You'll find more information about our project. I know that that also we will be kind of putting up the recordings of this webinar and of the other webinars, and there are other interesting materials, links to papers, blogs and so on. So I'd like to thank everyone for a really interesting session, and hopefully these kind of issues will continue to be talked about in academic and policy circles. Thank you very much.